Here is a question. Did you know how many miles the Indian Air Force has actually clocked on COVID duty in the last 40 days or so? 2 million miles. That is 1,500 sorties and 3,000 hours. Let me put that in perspective for you. 2 million miles is akin to flying 55 times around the globe. Yep, that's a lot of flying. It's the sort of flying that you do in times of a war. While in a war, your fighter fleet is the star of the show. In a pandemic, it's actually your transport fleet that does the heavy lifting. The Indian Air Force has deployed 6 types of its aircraft for the job with medium and heavy lift capabilities. For example, when massive containers, which is oxygen containers or tankers, are to be airlifted, the C-130 or the C-17 or the IL-76 is used. And when the load is lighter, say you're carrying medicines or oxygen cylinders and the journey is relatively shorter, the Indian Air Force is using the AN-32s and the Dorniers. So far, 42 aircraft have been pressed on COVID duty. 12 of them are heavy lift, 30 of them medium lift. Amongst themselves, they have carried 120 oxygen cylinders from abroad and transported some 125 tankers across India. Not possible. It's not safe. And it's against India's flying rules as well. So what the Indian Air Force instead is doing, it's using all its logistical muscle to try and ensure that the turnaround trip for oxygen is cut short, which means, for example, Hyderabad needs oxygen. What you do is you fly oxygen containers to Jamnagar. From Jamnagar, and you've flown these oxygen containers to Jamnagar, which means you've used an Indian Air Force plane. And then from Jamnagar, these containers are filled with oxygen and then they make their way to Hyderabad. So what have you done? You've cut down the time of the journey, the turnaround time as it were. And in this war, every second matters, as you know. The load that the Indian Air Force has carried so far is a massive 15,000 metric tons. Now, this is not a job the Indian Air Force is specifically trained for. What they are trained for is war and mobilizing for war. But then, the pandemic is the biggest war that India has ever fought or will ever fight. It has till now killed 3 lakh people, which is more Indians killed than in all the wars we have fought, including World War I and World War II. So what the Indian Air Force has now done is adapted and trained on the job to carry these massive oxygen cylinders and these very critical medical supplies.
If you say in the tactical, classical sense, a war means fighting an enemy who you can see. Here we are fighting an enemy which we cannot see. And so therefore there is no doubt that we have been learning on the job. However, we have improvised our methods, our procedures, the lessons that we have learned from carrying out operations on around the clock basis to ensure that whatever experience we have gained, whatever we have learned about the COVID itself, we have taken measures to mitigate within the organization and continue operations so that the task achieved is completed.
There were 2 big challenges along the way. One, of course, 2 cyclones in 2 weeks. You won't fly a plane into a storm until strictly necessary, will you? Which is why what the Indian Air Force did was that before either cyclone Yas was to hit or before Taute was to hit, the eastern and western coast, the cities in the eastern and western coast where this COVID supply was required, it was put there beforehand itself. Also, that wasn't the only job because you had to transport NDRF personnel as well to these areas, to the western coast and the eastern coast. That again was done by the Indian Air Force prior to the cyclone hitting. The other big challenge, of course, is how do you keep your crew safe from the virus? 95% of the Indian Air Force has been inoculated with both doses. But COVID protocols are rigorous and they are rigorously followed. 2 masks at all time. You can go to any airbase or the air headquarters, you'll see everyone in 2 masks, double masking. And you cannot step out of the airbase you're flying to, even if your family and friends live there.
Last week, Ahmedabad load was delayed by a day because of the cyclone, and so was Mumbai. And today also, we won't be able to undertake Bhubaneswar load because of cyclone. There are issues about pandemic where we have to keep our own crew also safe, because if few of them get infected, then they go into quarantine, then we won't have people to fly.
Important to remember here that the pandemic is not the only enemy at the door. The Northern Front remains active a year into the standoff with China. So, do COVID duties impact the operational readiness of the force? No, says the Indian Air Force.
The operational preparedness of the Indian Air Force continues to be at its optimum level, whether at the places which you mentioned at the forward areas or for various other tasks. At no stage have we let the op preparedness come down even one bit. This has happened because of proactive measures which were adopted by augmenting manpower.
Nabaha Sparsham Diptam is the motto of the Indian Air Force, means glory that touches the sky. And there can be no greater glory than flying home, something that the Indian Air Force has been doing for the last 40 odd days.